come down the waterfront to see these submarines being built. It is truly a magical thing.
The camera wasn't supposed to catch this. It was mounted 6 feet up a cypress trunk deep in the Big Cypress National Preserve, aimed at a narrow game trail, motion triggered, designed to run for weeks without anyone laying eyes on it. Dr. Michael Kirkland, a wildlife biologist with the USGS, had positioned 37 cameras like this one across a 12-mile corridor of South Florida wetland. The mission: document Burmese python activity, count them, map their movements. The camera ran for 6 weeks. Then Kirkland drove out, pulled the memory card, and drove back to the field station.
It's the stealthiest submarine that the U.S. Navy has ever produced.
He loaded the footage that night, and then he called every member of his team and told them to come in. Right now, not tomorrow, tonight. What was on that card was not what the camera was supposed to find. How paradise became a graveyard. Before we talk about what the camera footage revealed, we need to understand how the Florida python problem actually started. In August 24th, 1992, Hurricane Andrew made landfall south of Miami. Sustained winds of 165 miles per hour, 65 people dead, $27 billion in damage. It also destroyed a reptile breeding facility that housed Burmese pythons. The enclosures collapsed. An unknown number of large tropical constrictors slipped out into the night and into the water. Nobody went looking for them. Simultaneously, tens of thousands of pet owners across South Florida were making a decision. They'd bought Burmese pythons as exotic pets, manageable hatchlings that grew to 12 feet in a suburban house. The solution for too many owners was to drive to the edge of the Everglades and release the animal. They thought they were setting it free. They were loading a gun. The Everglades is the perfect environment for a Burmese python. Over 1.5 million acres of subtropical wetland, year-round heat and humidity, and a food supply so abundant and completely unprepared that it was an all-you-can-eat buffet with no closing time. The native wildlife, raccoons, opossums, rabbits, marsh birds, white-tailed deer, had spent thousands of years evolving alongside their actual predators: alligators, bobcats, Florida panthers. A Burmese python is not in that pattern library. A raccoon in the Florida Everglades had never encountered an ambush predator that could reach 15 feet, sense body heat in total darkness, lie motionless in 2 inches of water for hours, and strike faster than the eye could track. The raccoon would walk past a coiled python the way you or I might walk past a garden hose. Dr. Frank Mazzotti, a wildlife ecology professor at the University of Florida, put it in terms that stuck with every researcher who heard them. He said, "Releasing Burmese pythons into the Everglades was like releasing wolves into a petting zoo. The pythons didn't just survive, they consumed. A female Burmese python lays between 50 and 100 eggs per clutch and incubates them with the commitment music of a brooding bird. No native predator had evolved a strategy to deal with them. The population went vertical. Today, conservative estimates put Burmese pythons in South Florida at 100,000. Higher estimates reach 300,000. 300,000 apex predators in an ecosystem that had none of them 20 years ago." Mazzotti published a landmark study documenting the damage. Raccoons down 99.3%, not 10%, not 50. 99.3 from ubiquitous to functionally absent. Opossums crashed 98.9%. Bobcats fell 87% species after species not reduced, collapsed. But the numbers are not the most haunting part of the story. The most haunting part is the silence. Mazzotti described driving the same roads through the Everglades that he had driven for 3 decades. Roads where, in the 1980s, you couldn't travel 100 yards without slowing for an animal. Now his team drives for miles and finds nothing. No movement. No eyes in the headlights. Just road and sawgrass and the hum of the engine in a silence that shouldn't exist. He described pulling over at a spot where he had once photographed 53 individual mammals in a 2-hour period. Stepping out of the truck, listening, nothing. The implications go far beyond heartbreak. The Everglades provides flood protection and water filtration for millions of people, recharges the drinking water aquifers for one of the fastest growing regions in the country. Ecologists estimate its annual economic value at more than $31. The small mammals the pythons consumed were not peripheral to this system. They were foundational. The pythons weren't just eating animals, they were dismantling a machine, hunting ghosts in the grass. Florida's response began with the Florida Python Challenge, a public hunting competition. In its 2024 iteration, participants removed 195 pythons. If the population is 300,000, that's 0.065%, a single breeding aggregation could replace every snake the challenge. Removed not a solution, not even a dent. So the state hired full-time professional contractors. Donna Khalil became one of the most recognized. She described hunting pythons at night, the headlamp sweeping across the berm, finding nothing, and then something registers at the edge of your vision. A shadow that doesn't match the vegetation, and then it resolves a body, the diameter of a telephone pole, coiled so still it looked like a root. She called it hunting ghosts. Since the contractor program launched in 2017, these hunters have removed more than 23,000 Burmese pythons from Florida, 23,000 animals, and yet that number likely represents less than 5% of the total. The pipeline constantly refills every available technology. Failed thermal drones couldn't detect cold-blooded snakes matching the ambient temperature. Robotic prey decoys were ignored. Pythons are ambush predators that simply waited for real prey. The one approach showing genuine results is the Judas snake program. Researchers surgically implant a GPS tracker in a sexually mature male, release him, and follow him straight to a breeding aggregation during mating season. Ian Bartoshek of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida pioneered this technique and used it to locate and remove some of the largest breeding females ever recorded. But the spatial scale of the Everglades makes meaningful coverage impossible, and veteran hunters began saying something difficult to dismiss. Mike Kimmel, known as Python Cowboy, said, "These animals are learning. The snakes are withdrawing into deep sawgrass and cypress hammocks where no human presence is consistent. The breeding populations are concentrating in the areas hardest to reach," he said. "They're adapting to us faster than we're adapting to them, the invisible plague." What if the most dangerous thing in Florida's swamp was not the 20-foot constrictor? What if the invasion had a second wave already, years ahead of where anyone knew to look? Dr. Terrence Farrell, a herpetologist at Stetson University, was conducting routine health screenings on wild-caught animals when he noticed something wrong. Not with the pythons, with the native snakes. Garter snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, eastern diamondbacks showing up emaciated, lethargic, mouths hanging open in respiratory distress. When his team performed necropsies, they found the lungs packed. Dozens of small, pale, translucent organisms, visibly alive, visibly motile, tangled in dense masses inside the respiratory passages of animals, slowly suffocating. In snakes still alive during examination, the organisms could be seen extruding from open mouths too weak to close. The organism is Rileyetiella orientalis, the snake lungworm, and it came to Florida inside the Burmese pythons. The lungworm and the Burmese python share millions of years of coevolutionary history. In Southeast Asia, the python's immune system manages the parasite load without serious clinical effects. It is a carrier. Florida's native snakes have never encountered this organism. Their immune systems have no template for it. Farrell described it as first contact between European explorers and isolated indigenous populations. One group developed some resistance, the other has none. The results are catastrophic. The transmission pathway makes it nearly impossible to contain. An infected python deposits waste containing microscopic larvae, cockroaches, ubiquitous throughout the Everglades, consume the waste and pick up the larvae. A native frog eats the cockroach. A native snake eats the frog. This is not aberrant behavior. This is how the system has always worked. Except now, the frog is carrying a death sentence. Once inside the snake, the larvae bore through the stomach wall, migrate to the respiratory system, and anchor in the lungs. They feed, grow, reproduce. Over weeks or months, the airways fill. The snake weakens progressively. Eventually, it suffocates. Farrell described it as drowning in slow motion. Dr. Melissa Miller, a parasitologist at the University of Florida, established the full extent. At minimum, 18 distinct native snake species confirmed infected, the geographic distribution extending as far north as Jacksonville, hundreds of miles from the Everglades. And then came the finding that Miller said made her go cold. The lungworm no longer needs the python. The parasite has completed a host shift. It has established a self-sustaining transmission cycle operating entirely through the native snake community without any Burmese python involvement. Even if every single python in Florida were somehow removed overnight, the lungworm would remain. It is in the cockroaches. It is in the frogs. It is cycling through the ecosystem on its own terms. The plague is self-sustaining. Florida now faces catastrophe on two simultaneous fronts. The pythons consuming the mammal community from above, the lungworm destroying the native reptile community from below, the Everglades being demolished from the roofline and the foundation at the same time. But buried inside the horror of the survey data, researchers found one anomaly. The Florida cottonmouth appears to be resistant to the lungworm. Farrell's team examined cottonmouths in areas of confirmed heavy infection and found almost nothing. Parasite loads so low as to be functionally insignificant. Nobody can explain it yet, but somewhere in the biology of this one resistant species, there may be information that could eventually protect others. The Emperor returns. Florida. Fish and Wildlife's next announcement caused immediate outrage. They were releasing hundreds of snakes into the wild. On purpose, the people reacting had not read past the first sentence. The snake being released was the eastern indigo, not an invader, the exact opposite. A species native to the southeastern United States, once abundant across Florida, driven to functional extinction by habitat loss and absent from key ecosystems for more than 50 years. Drymarchon cooperi, the eastern indigo snake, the longest native snake in North America. Scales so deeply black they refract into blue-green iridescence in direct sunlight. The word researchers and wildlife photographers most commonly use when they encounter one in the field is not impressive or striking. The word they use is beautiful, but the eastern indigo's beauty is incidental to its ecological significance. What matters is what it eats. The eastern indigo is an ophiophage, a snake eater. It is completely immune to the venom of every pit viper in North America. Rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, copperheads, the indigo overpowers them with jaw strength and body mass and swallows them headfirst while they're still thrashing. Dr. Dirk Stevenson of the Oriane Society calls it the emperor of the forest floor. At the ground level of the southeastern forest, nothing challenges an adult eastern indigo, but the emperor had been displaced. The eastern indigo depends on gopher tortoise burrows for shelter. When Florida's development boom converted native longleaf pine flatwoods into residential and agricultural land, tortoise populations declined, and the indigos declined with them. By 1978, the eastern indigo was functionally gone from North Florida. The Oriane Society began a captive breeding program and spent years reconstructing longleaf pine ecosystems in the Florida Panhandle, not just planting trees, but rebuilding the full community of species that a functioning longleaf flatwood requires. The understory, the fire regime, the gopher tortoise colonies that would provide the burrow networks the indigos need. When the habitat was ready, they began releasing captive-bred eastern indigos into the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. Then, in late 2023, a trail camera at the entrance to a gopher tortoise burrow captured footage that made Dirk Stevenson watch it 11 times before he let himself believe what he was seeing. Two eastern indigo hatchlings, not released animals, hatchlings, born in the wild, conceived in the wild, hatched in the wild without any human assistance, no longer than a pencil, moving with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has no reasonable predators. For the first time in more than 50 years, eastern indigo snakes were reproducing autonomously music in North Florida. The emperor was not just returning. The emperor was rebuilding its dynasty, the collision course. Go back to Dr. Kirkland's trail camera, the footage that made him call his team in that night. A bobcat, 25 pounds, dragging the decapitated body of a 50-pound Burmese python through the mud. The head was gone. Targeted first, neutralized. The rest of the snake killed after. The bobcat habitat was dragging the carcass, claiming it. For 20 years, the Burmese python had existed as an apex predator with no serious challengers, not because native predators couldn't theoretically pose a threat, but because they had no learned experience with this animal. That was changing. Alligators were being documented ambushing smaller pythons. Trail cameras from Everglades National Park showed a Florida panther, one of fewer than 200 remaining in the wild, stalking a python for 20 minutes through a palmetto thicket before making a final approach and strike. Ian Easterling, a National Park Service wildlife technician, told colleagues, "The native predators are doing something nobody's models predicted they were learning. A python digesting a large meal is sluggish and vulnerable. A python in cooler temperatures is metabolically suppressed. A python's head is proportionally fragile to a predator that strikes fast enough to end the fight before it begins. For the first time in 20 years, the pythons are taking losses. The Everglades is not recovering, but it is fighting back. And the eastern indigo snakes are moving south toward the ecosystem that needs them most. A juvenile Burmese python, 3 or 4 feet long, falls within the size range an eastern indigo could overpower. For a small python, the indigo almost certainly wins. A mature 15-foot female that weighs 150 to 200 pounds is a different equation. Stevenson has been asked about this encounter in multiple interviews. His answer is consistent. He says, "I honestly don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody has observed that encounter in the wild. But there is a genuine possibility that the eastern indigo could exert meaningful predation pressure on the juvenile python population. Every juvenile that doesn't survive to adulthood is a reproductive failure for the invasion. And hanging over all of it is the question Farrell has called the thing that frightens him most. Not the pythons, the lungworm. Can Rileytina orientalis infect an eastern indigo snake? The indigo's venom immunity is specific, tied to molecular features of its blood chemistry. There is no reason to assume it extends to a parasitic nematode with a completely different biological profile. If the lungworm reaches eastern indigo populations before they achieve self-sustaining densities, it could eliminate the emperor before the emperor can accomplish what everyone needs it to accomplish. It could kill the restoration." Kirkland kept a copy of the memory card. Sometimes when the work felt particularly heavy, he would watch the 6 weeks of footage compress into a single session. The stillness, nights when nothing moved through the frame at all, the silence Mazzotti had described, captured now in unmoving, unbothered darkness. The battle for the Everglades, what began as a handful of released and escaped Burmese pythons, has become one of the largest invasive predator crises in modern history. Over the past several decades, these giant constrictors have spread throughout the Everglades, an ecosystem perfectly suited to their survival. With few natural enemies and an abundant food supply, their population exploded. The consequences have been devastating. In some areas, mammal populations such as raccoons, opossums, and bobcats have collapsed by more than 90%, transforming once vibrant wetlands into landscapes marked by an unsettling silence. But the pythons are only part of the problem. Researchers discovered that the snakes also introduced an invasive parasite known as the snake lungworm. Unlike the pythons that carried it, Florida's native snake species had no evolutionary defenses against this organism. The parasite spread through the food chain, infecting frogs, reptiles, and eventually native snakes, damaging their lungs and slowly suffocating them. Even more alarming, scientists found that the parasite no longer depends on pythons to survive. It has established itself within the ecosystem and can now spread independently. In response, wildlife officials have launched an unprecedented effort to fight back. Professional hunters have removed thousands of pythons. Researchers have developed tracking programs to locate breeding populations, and conservation groups have begun restoring native species like the eastern indigo snake, a powerful predator that may help suppress young pythons in the future. At the same time, signs of resistance are beginning to appear. Bobcats, alligators, and even Florida panthers have been documented attacking pythons, suggesting that native predators may be adapting to the invaders' presence. Today, the Everglades stands at a crossroads crossroads. The pythons continue to spread. The parasite continues to circulate. Yet conservationists, scientists, and native wildlife are still fighting for the future of one of America's most important ecosystems. The outcome remains uncertain, and the battle is far from over.